Hi guys, and welcome to November's Citizens Chat podcast. Now you'll see next to me that we have the lovely Sarah Lilly from Cerebral Palsy Midlands, and I thought it would be really good actually to discuss what an accessible life looks like, which is why I've brought Sarah onto this podcast today. So I suppose the first thing that I really want to get into, Sarah, if that's okay, is if you can just tell me a little bit about yourself, for myself and our viewers, just so that we know a bit about you, really.
Yeah, so as well as the development officer for Cerebral Palsy Midlands, in my home life, I've grown up with having a sister who's got cerebral palsy and very complex needs with having cerebral palsy. And she's 4 years younger than me, so I've naturally grown up as a sort of secondary carer. And actually now, as she gets older, more like a second mother figure in her life, and that means that, one, I'm really passionate about disability and advocacy and inclusion, but it's something that drives me forward in my career and outside of my work as well, because I've volunteered to get involved with the Commonwealth Games, supporting people with disabilities. I wasn't outside in the Commonwealth, like in the show, but behind the scenes I'd been there supporting people just before they literally went out to make sure they were fully cared for, had the right support. So yeah, it's just something that I feel is more than just a job.
Yeah. So it's something obviously that's really close to your heart. Yeah. And I suppose, that's where we've got quite a lot in common. I've got a cerebral palsy as well. And I think, I consider myself quite lucky because there's varying ranges of CP, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that I've got it the worst as what other people have got, such as Vicky, and everything. So I'm able to get about quite a lot. But I'd be really interested to know, obviously you said that you grew up being a secondary carer. What was it actually like growing up with Vicky, from the get-go, finding out about her disability as you were growing up?
I don't think I really understood it in the younger days, but I did know naturally that I had to support my mum a lot with the care, because my dad was working shifts, and when he wasn't around, I was pretty much hands-on. And I even remember being sort of 4 or 5 years old and running to get nappies to help and grab the wipes, grab this. So I was doing very domesticated chores at a very young age. I didn't think anything of it. I'm not saying I had a bad childhood, and it didn't do me, didn't do me any harm or anything, but I was doing what my friends weren't doing. And as I grew up then to become a teenager, and all my friends wanted to go out and do things all the time, there was times when I had to say no because my mum needed me or needed that little bit more support. And unless you've grown up having a sibling that has got complex needs, you wouldn't really empathise or understand. Yeah. So it did affect me in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult because obviously I come from the other end of that, really, from the point of view, I'm the eldest child and I've got 2 younger siblings, younger brother and a younger sister. Now I think naturally from my experience, my parents have always focused on me more so than my brother and sister, from the point of view of making sure that I do get the opportunities that I should be getting and not sort of overlooked because of my disability. They got me into riding at a really young age just as a form of therapy for my disability, and it ended up being a massive thing that I started competing with internationally and everything. So my brother and sister really took a back seat, and I suppose one thing that I've always been conscious about is actually what effect that had on them.
Well, I can tell you it's something that people don't want to talk about, because the last thing you want to do is upset your family that have already gone through really challenging times, and it's not something that they chose. Having a disability, having cerebral palsy is something my sister was born with. So it wasn't a choice, but we all have to sort of support. You have to really be a strong family network, or if you're not, it kind of pushes you to be. But yeah, the side effects of that are that as the older sibling, I had a very different childhood. And no, you're not a priority in that family. The person with the disability is, rightly so. But then sometimes, and I don't know if this sounds harsh on my parents, but it's not. But, you know, you do get sidelined. You're not the number one in that family household. Yet now I've grown up to realise I am as important, actually. And, you know, my success and my career and whatever I want to do in life is just as important. But I kind of had to go and get some help with understanding that that was the case, because that hadn't come across in my sort of family surrounding, that hadn't come across or hadn't come over. Yeah. But that wasn't there. Like, I also understand it from their point of view as well, that they didn't know. They were just trying to cope with the daily challenges of having a young child with disability who was in a wheelchair, had communication, had toileting needs, had dysphagia, so had feeding needs, and it was 24, you know, it was a very hands-on physical requirement, and that's why they needed that help.
So, as you were growing up with Vicky, would you say that you were quite aware of how inaccessible things were, and still are for Vicky as you were growing up? Or
yeah, so Vicky's pretty much always had the house adapted, so all the doors widened, and obviously ramp access into the house. And at one point she was upstairs and it was a lift that used to go up, and then the house got adapted again, so she was downstairs. And now Vicky lives independently, but that was a massive, painful time for us to go through as a family, to accept that, one, Vicky deserved her independence, but also that you then put your trust into somebody else to do all those things that you were spending years doing. But it is the right thing to do, but it's I think most families, and the fear of letting go of that person that they've cared for years and years and years is really, really tough.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, isn't it? I think, you know, as I've got older, especially since I've retired from my sport in particular, so me going out and competing, it's always been mine and my mum's thing. So my mum has always been there, because I can't tack the horse up on my own. I can't get on and off the horse on my own. And mum would be, despite the fact that I had a coach and or instructor at whatever time or point within my sporting career, my mum was always there, because that's the person that I trust the most out of anyone in the world. I trust her with my life. But I think since finishing and retiring from my sport, from the level that I was, I think it's a bit of a loss, really, because it's something that me and my mum no longer do, and that's always been our thing, really. And I think it is difficult, not just for me to let go of, but for my mum as well, because that's been her life.
I'd like to add in there as well that through my sister being very complex needs and physically demanding with the care needs, that had an effect on my mum. So there was times when I used to work at the University of Birmingham, had a really good career, and had to take unpaid leave because my mum was had slipped discs or had chronic back pain and couldn't do the care, and there wasn't the emergency services or respite or anything like that, so I'd have to take that time out unpaid as an adult. There was times as well where we did have respite care, emergency respite care, and we had to pull Vicky out because when we went and did visits and checks as a family, and my mum was in hospital in chronic pain or with slipped discs, we were seeing a really horrible set of affairs that, like, for example, no underwear on, teeth not brushed, hair matted, and all the horrible things that you hear about. So we were pulling Vicky out of those respite places that weren't great, and then I was having to ring up my boss and just say I cannot come into work, and I'm using all my annual leave, or anything really to sort of, or having to work over and overtime and outside my hours and on weekends just to kind of help my family out in a really difficult situation. So when we looked at Vicky moving, it was to protect us all, because I had started to have a family of my own. I've got 2 wonderful teenage children, but when they came into my life, I knew I couldn't just ring up my boss and say, can I take 6 to 8 weeks unpaid because my mum's had an accident and can no longer provide that care. So we had to kind of put in, if you will, a sort of protection measure for us all that would make sure that Vicky constantly had the care that she needed. It's not like we were going to turn her back as well on her when she left and went to live independently. I think it was the right thing to do. But the other thing that parents really struggle with when they finally let that happen is guilt. This a massive sense of guilt. And instead of my mum having a lease of life and starting to live her life, I've actually seen my strong sort of mom woman that was like a superhero growing up, that was this super duper energetic person that had, 4 young children, one of them with really complex needs, doing so much, and then now she's just really struggling, pretty much disabled herself from the years of care.
Yeah.
And so this lease of life that she always wanted isn't now available now.
Yeah. And I suppose, going back to the accessibility thing, which, we've touched on a little bit here, have you got any examples of when things have been really, really inaccessible for Vicky?
I've got so many. I could be here for a really long time. But I'll go through one that stands out recently in my memory. We took Vicky to Tenby, which was a place we used to go with Vicky when she was younger, and they've got accessible houses around Tenby that are all adapted with changing place facilities, toilets, wet rooms, ceiling track hoists, profile beds, which to us, that's exactly what we need. That's the mandatory equipment that we require when we go and take Vicky anywhere on holiday. If it doesn't have any of those things, it's not accessible. So we have to have a certain amount of equipment. It has to have ramps, it has to not have steps, it has to have widened doors, it has to have a wet room. The ceiling track hoist is so important for Vicky because she's, with her complex needs and with her cerebral palsy, she's got irregular movements, which she can't help. So that ceiling track hoist protects us when we're sort of lifting and kind of manual handling and personal care, specialist shower chairs, you name it. The equipment's quite heavy when we go anywhere. So the houses are adapted there. That's great. But Tenby's also the most hilliest place I think I've ever been to. That all being said, it wasn't that was the issue. I couldn't take Vicky into a pub that didn't have steps in. There was not one. All Vicky wanted to do on holiday, she's 34 now, she wants to go into a pub and have a Malibu and Coke or whatever she likes to drink and do what people do when they go on holiday, right? That's it. And we went out day after day and just couldn't find any venues, even the shops. And I get it. It's a very old historic town with cobbled pavements and cobbled streets and all of that. However, there was no attempt at even becoming accessible. So there was no press this button here and we will let you in a side entrance, or come in and ask and we can put a ramp out for you. Some places could. There was just nowhere we could go. So we were then having to drive out of Tenby to find places to take Vicky that were suitable, that are typically accessible, like Wetherspoons and that kind of. There are other pubs and venues, I'm sure you have to, I don't know what you have to say on your podcast, but yeah, places that are accessible. That I just found Tenby was like the most inaccessible place that I'd gone to.
And then when you come across things like that situation whilst you were on holiday with Vicky where it is particularly inaccessible, how does that affect you guys both, on a mental basis as well as like physically? Because I know that physically it's challenging from whoever's looking after Vicky to have to pick her up potentially to be able to get her to where she needs to be if it was in that event. But I'm aware that, especially if you're on holiday as well as Vicky,
it's not a holiday. If I'm there with Vicky, it's not a holiday. In fact, I think that holiday that we went on was an awakening to my parents, that they thought they could do all this stuff for Vicky and care for her still, and it was the awakening that they weren't able to do that anymore, because the amount from the time I take Vicky anywhere, because I've recently taken her to Calvert Trust, which was more positive, so I'll talk about that in a bit. But from the time Vicky gets up through the time that I put her into bed, it's been full on. There's no break time for me as an individual. And, you're thickening drinks, you're making sure food's blended, you're having to hoist, I cannot leave my sister on her own. So it's constant from that moment in time. So that holiday wasn't really a holiday for me, but I felt bad because Vicky doesn't get those opportunities like we do, where we can just go to the seaside or be by the sea even, or go on holiday. So that was her one holiday, and all she wanted to do was to just go into a pub on a holiday and do very typically normal things, and we couldn't offer her that really.
And I suppose, through helping Vicky, and I can tell from just talking to you today with how much Vicky has sort of influenced you as a person within your professional career in every way, which shape or form. How has that influenced you with your work in particular, would you say? Because I can see that you're really passionate about it.
I think I know how much the work that I do makes a difference on the community of people that I'm supporting. So I know that when I'm running any of the campaigns that we do, or when I'm trying to fundraise, I know where that money's going and how that's going to enable, for example, if we fundraise for a new minibus and we've got a new minibus, that means we can do more trips out into the community, because the community of people that I work with complex needs, it is harder for them to get out. I mean, many reasons why. We did a study with a geography student a few years ago now, and he was a PhD geography student, and he wanted to look at how accessible Harborne was, which is where our charity is situated. So we took clients out with GoPro cameras on them and went down Harborne High Street, and just to see how local our accessible High Street was, and 50% of the places you can't get in because you've got wheelchairs or people with mobility. Now that doesn't necessarily mean for disabled people, that's elderly too that might have scooters. So straight away they're stripped of being able to access the services in their local high street. There's no change in place facilities, so if any of ours did potentially need the toilet that needed that, that's not available to them. Even some of the disabled toilets were used as storing cupboards, in certain venues, which was really difficult, or they didn't know where the key was, or the staff members genuinely didn't even know they'd got a disabled toilet. You've got, as you go down the high street, there was bar signs. So
because they're plotted up, aren't they?
Yeah. So you've got electric wheelchair users that are now having to go back on themselves, down a ramp, into the road to go potentially up the high street in a very dangerous situation because businesses are blocking the accessibility without even knowing. And those are just a few of the kind of things that we highlighted. Cars parked on pavements. So again, what's interesting about the cars parked on pavements, because I understand, Harborne's a very highly populated area and parking's a nightmare. However, if you're in a mobility scooter or wheelchair and you need the pavement to get around safely, if the cars are blocking that means that those people have got to go into the road, and it's darker nights, it's harder for them to get out. So accessing the community is not easy. It's it's full of barriers, and that's why charities like us exist, to help people access the community, to make sure they've got the transport, the care. We would double check those venues are accessible, make sure we know where the changing places facilities are, make sure we've got everything we can do to support their care needs, and kind of risk assess the whole kind of journey and outing itself.
So I suppose the next question is, if you can give us a bit more of an overview in terms of what you guys at Cerebral Palsy Midlands do for the people that you support, that would be great. And also maybe give us an example of one of the campaigns that you've done. I know that Wheel and Walk is one that I'd attended last year, which I found was really, really interesting to see. So maybe you could just tell us a bit about that as well.
So Cerebral Palsy Midlands are a charity, first and foremost. They're a registered charity, and they've been going since 1947. Initially, there was Carlson House School, which was a school specifically for people with CP. That was one of the first in the UK at the time. And then it was called MSA at the time. And that was next door to Colson House School, that had a welfare sort of centre for families, for people with CP. At the time, they were doing research. They'd got physios, they'd got therapists in. It was I wouldn't say it was a new thing, cerebral palsy, no, but I think it was after the war and the educational reforms, and people wanting to set these things up. So it said that everybody had the right to education, everybody had the right to work, and then born from that you had centres being set up to empower people with disability. So that's where kind of Cerebral Palsy Midlands begun. And now we are more of a day service for adults with not just CP, we've got other disabilities as well. But it might be as well that somebody's got cerebral palsy and a learning disability, or cerebral palsy and autism, or cerebral palsy and therefore their needs are great and complex, which might mean they need 1-to-1, 2-to-1 help with activities, feeding, toileting, lots of different realms to that. So in our day-to-day sort of setup, we've got different groups and different activities going on. From wheelchair dance, Tai Chi, we've got our very own rock band. We've just had Halloween discos. We do quizzes, karaoke, cookery, taking people out into the community. And I've probably missed art, and I've probably missed things off in that. So, but we're we're not just a day service. So I think we've got a big heart. We understand the needs of our clients, and all the things that we do in our centre are what the clients have asked us to do. So that's another thing to say. We're person-centred, if that makes sense. So, and everything that we do has been born from speaking to our clients. So the Wheel and Walk, they hadn't done anything like that. And we were brainstorming about how we would get out into the community and how we would do it in a way that people would notice that we were present in the community. So at that day, it was called the Big Push for us. And we went out to Cannon Hill Park, which is a really lovely accessible park in Birmingham. It's got changing place facilities at the MAC. It's got disabled parking. It was great when I went and did the risk assessment, because it was a really lovely flat park, widened paths, and it was perfect really for the remit of doing it. So we did the Big Push. And then at the time, so I also have links with Birmingham Fab Camps. I was on their trustee committee at the time, helping with fundraising. And I'm also an unpaid director and trustee for Sociability Care, who have a charity, Noah's Star, who work with young children in the neonatal units. And the lady that runs that, her child has got cerebral palsy. So we were all sort of I was on these boards, and they were all trying to do the same thing. They were all small charities who wanted to get themselves out into the community and do a bit of fundraising for their own individual charities. But we were all sort of advocating inclusion, advocating accessibility. We wanted to come together. So the Wheel and Walk then was kind of an idea that came about because I wanted us to collaborate. Yeah. And I saw this vision of it becoming bigger than that. And I'm kind of, when I get those ideas as a creative person, I think, just go with it. And when we actually did it in collaboration with the other charities, it was bigger, it was better, it was more eye-catching, it was more engaging. We had better fundraising results because people like the fact that you're working in unison with other charities and you've got that idea about inclusion. So then I had another dream before the pandemic that it was going to grow again, and you were on the committee for that, I think. And so Midland Mencap, we had Focus, we had other charities on board. So it was going to go from 3 charities to 8 charities and be this inclusive walk in Birmingham. And then the pandemic happened and that got cancelled. So here we are again, and I think we're trying to get that committee of charities, small charities together, because on our own, walking around Cannon Hill Park, it really doesn't look like we're such a small charity. We've got 50 citizens that are probably on our register and our books that we support and their families, but that doesn't look like a lot in a big park like Cannon Hill. But then when you start to collaborate with others and you've got more of we're set up at the bandstand, we've now got banners, we get support from like ASDA champions or community champions in different sort of companies. And then you start to see the impact of that. Yeah. It's much better. So I think the plan is to move forward with that. But I'd like it to become Birmingham's Inclusive Walk.
Yeah, and I think actually, because I was there last year, not necessarily for Midland Mencap, but on a personal level, having CP myself. And it was really lovely to see, because actually, although there was a few charities there and people from different charities, it almost seemed like really family orientated across the whole of it. Like everyone was talking. It was more, it was really nice and relaxed rather than almost like, right, we're here to do a job.
Yeah.
This is what we're doing.
And also, I know some might say, yeah, but you're competitive charities to some extent. But actually, we offer a different elements of support and services. So people that, for example, would go there to fundraise for Birmingham Fab Camps because they go on their holidays or their children go on their holidays, they might not know that we existed as a charity and that there was a charity called Cerebral Palsy Midlands. So actually, it was better for us to sort of be as one in that event, because all these families that need to know what's out there to support them all of a sudden have got these charities collaborate. Really. Yeah.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's similar to like us at Midland Mencap and what I do more specifically with Include Me. You see so many people, don't you, like looking for information and support. It is like a secret society. And actually we offer a really wide range of services here at Midland Mencap. But there's always going to be something that we're going to create a shortfall with. So something, for example, like supporting someone with cerebral palsy, but has someone who has also got a learning disability. We might be able to really, really support the learning disability side of things, but we might not necessarily be as, equipped to be able to support the cerebral palsy side of things, which is where you guys would come in. And actually that's where it creates the importance for us organisations and disability groups to actually work on a collaborative and co-produce things to make sure that actually we're working on a more simultaneous level, to make sure if an individual that we've highlighted, for example, we can support here and here, but actually we're really struggling to support them there. That's where we can do the referral to you guys and go, you know what, we can't do this for them, but we know that Cerebral Palsy Midlands can, and vice versa. Yeah. That's the importance of working on a simultaneous level, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and also we can be part of bigger ideas as well. So Birmingham Airport, for example, have an accessible forum, and they want all the charities out there to get on board and tell them how their airport can be more accessible. So when I go and join their forums, I'm one of 20, 30 different charities. You know, you've got Deafblind UK, you've got all sorts of different charities, WizKids, and it's great because we all sort of want the airport to be as accessible to help people if they want to go on holidays abroad or whatever, or they want to travel. And some of the discussions that we have direct impact and have direct change and influence in the airport to enable them to change. So, for example, when I first started on that forum, about 8 years ago, they didn't have a hoist for people in wheelchairs. I think they lifted people from a small wheelchair onto a seat, and now they've got an Eagle hoist. And because we took Vicky with us, my sister, and sort of said, so how are you going to get Vicky on the airplane? You know, how are you going to do it? And ask those questions, and what are you going to do, and what if, and how. And so they had to adapt because they realised that there's people with disability represent, I think, I was reading something today, 22% of the population. So 22% of the population have money to go on holidays and travel and do those things. So you need to make it as accessible so they can contribute to the economy.
Exactly.
And wouldn't that help us all out?
And actually it's one of those things, isn't it? And that's where it all comes with, includes me with what we're trying to do there, is actually create that place where people with a lived experience as well as organisations can actually work on a more collaborative front. Because I'd say it's quite understandable from an organisation point of view, whether that is a local cafe on Harborne High Street, whatever that might be, or even Harborne Leisure Centre, just making sure they're not going to know what's going to make something accessible, because at the end of the day, 90% of the time, I'd say things like that are run by people who are able-bodied, that don't have a lived experience. And actually, until they actually have that conversation with people who have those lived experiences, it's not going to get the clogs turning with, oh, actually, I should try this. Or actually, maybe I should think about this completely differently than what I am, because it does sort of segregate a whole proportion of society, doesn't it? As a result, because it's just not really thought about.
I think we're not there yet, and I do know that the council work hard to make improvements in the city, but I still think it needs to extend out into the local high streets. That's where people want to go. They don't always want to go into the city centre, because if you've got certain disabilities, that can be very overwhelming or daunting.
It's stressful, because you're having to think, aren't you? If you drive, where am I going to have to park? Where is the nearest accessible parking facility? How far am I going to have to go to get from where I'm parking to where I actually want to be? It's like a whole day. Well, you've got to plan well in advance to be able to make sure that you can do it. It's really stressful. So
when I was working with Freewheeling Wheelchair Dance, and they were part of the Commonwealth Games opening ceremonies, but prior to that they had a culture show called Wondrous Stories, which was run by Motion House, and that was in front of the Rep. And that they'd got a group called Critical Mass. So all these names are irrelevant, but they were people who had volunteered to be involved in a show, who were you and me type people. They weren't professional dancers. And Critical Mass worked with groups of people, and they rehearsed at the NEC, and then we started to rehearse. It got complicated when we started to rehearse outside the Rep, because actually there's so many things to consider for people with disability. So where we were going to be situated whilst we were waiting to go on and off and perform, where were the toilets, how many were there, where were the changing place facilities, how were you going to be able to feed somebody who's got maybe dysphagia. Some people had oxygen needs and requirements. Where are they going to store the canisters safely? Where were we going to put our belongings whilst we were hanging around in the freezing cold, because it was February. And there was a lot of logistics about going off and on stage. So when we first got to the stage, there was just cables and cables and cables, and we've got electric wheelchairs, which cost thousands of pounds, trying to go over electric cables. So we had to have a word with the organisers and say, can't do that, it's a massive safety hazard. Yeah. So they go, OK, that's great. And they go away and they build a wooden ramp. And the next day it was raining as well. So we went around.
Oh, God.
We got to this wooden ramp and all the wheelchairs are sliding all over this ramp because of the rain. So we had to go back to the organisers and say, we are so sorry, we're grateful for the ramp, thank you for doing that for us. But we're slipping all over it, and that could happen on the night. It's a risk, it's a hazard. Somebody could have an accident. So they then had to kind of get it, not gritted, but there's like material that you can put down that would help the wheelchairs. And so it must have cost them, and they hadn't factored that into their budget. So these are extras that they've just been landed with that they've got to sort out, because it's not, they just hadn't thought it through. They're not in it, like you said, they haven't got the lived experience. And then there was a moment where they'd got it right, and we all went on to the court to do our rehearsal for the up-and-coming show. And somebody, I'm not saying who, but somebody said, is everything okay for you, Rewheeling? Is there anything else you possibly need? Like we had been prima donnas sort of asking for a red carpet to be rolled out. And it was really deflating, because we're all there volunteering our time to be involved in a magical thing that was in the city. And I'm still grateful I was a part of it. But some of those moments weren't nice when you're asking for what we would say are very basic requirements, basic needs for the people that we're supporting. And then some people think that you're asking for the red carpet to be rolled out, and it's not that they're asking. They're just asking to have the same access as everybody else onto that platform. But yeah, just experience. I've got so many experiences. And it becomes, as you've just said, it's really deflating, isn't it? Because it puts you off then if you go somewhere and it turns out to be inaccessible. You don't want to go back again, because actually, like the times where, and as I said at the beginning of this podcast, I see myself as quite fortunate, because I wouldn't say that I've got my disability as severe as what some people have. There are still things that I find inaccessible, and actually I find it quite embarrassing. Like, I've been brought up to be a really independent person. So I find it really embarrassing if it's something really stupid, like getting through a turnstile, right? If I'm going to the gym or something and I've got my gym bag, there needs to be a proper accessible thing that I can go through, like a wheelchair way or something, because I just cannot. If I've got my gym bag with me, if I'm going through a turnstile, I can't hoist it up. It's not that easy and everything. So like getting stuck in a turnstile, I'm like, oh my God, like it's just really embarrassing. Please help. The biggest challenge I think many of our people face is actually transport. Yeah. And people's response to that is, well, the buses, you can get on the buses and trains. I mean, the amount of stories I know about people who have booked assistance in these areas and no one's turned up, and they've been sitting on a train for half an hour at the station. And that's still happening. That's not like I'm telling you a story from 3 years ago. I'm telling you a story that I heard last week. We have people in our service who book taxis to go out into the community. Their taxis come onto the car park and they drive off. So even though they were booked knowing that the person's got an electric wheelchair, or they sometimes don't even turn up at all. And I mean, this is just reality. This is how it is. So when we talk about accessing the community is not ready. It's not accessible yet. That's why we exist as a charity. If it was accessible, I think we wouldn't need day services as much, because people would be able to be independently accessing the community as it is. And there's still a long, long way to go.
Yeah, and I suppose that brings me on to one of my last questions with you, Sarah, is what do you think needs to change in order to make society more accessible, not just for Vicky, but with anyone with a disability or long-term health condition?
So I think it goes down to education, because from the very outset, at young age, you have to do, I can't remember, it used to be PSE when I was younger, and they've changed the names of these things, but basically you learn about sexuality, you learn about culture, and you learn about things like that. So why aren't we embedding into the education that, especially seen as 22% of our population have got a disability? I'm not just talking about cerebral palsy, Alzheimer's, mental health is now a disability. You've got mobility issues, people who are just immobility, it's an impairment, disability, blindness, and all sorts. And why we just don't talk about it? It's like, let's not talk about it and we can just imagine that it doesn't exist. That's not the way we need to do it. We actually need to talk about the uncomfortable disabilities that are out there, not uncomfortable because they're disabilities, but uncomfortable conversations. We need to have them. We need to teach our children that we live in a diverse society, and some people need more support, and some people might need that extra help, and that's why we need those widened doors, and that's why when people go and build new buildings, we have to have change in place facilities. We need to tell them at the very outset. So I think it needs to be built into the curriculum, is my honest answer. I don't think that would solve it completely, but I think if we're educating people like we do with religion, like we do with basic, subjects, I think we need to have disability in at that age as well.
And so say if there's anyone listening to this podcast that, might be someone who is running a cafe, for example, on Harborne High Street, and they're thinking, right, I'm listening to this, Sarah's telling me this is what needs to be done to make things more accessible. What sort of, if you could give them one bit of advice to become more accessible, what would it be?
So interestingly, Harborne have got a brilliant community Facebook page, and I wanted to get my sister's hair done, and I'm thinking, well, 50% of the places in Harborne don't have, ramps, they've got steps in. But anyway, I put it on the Harborne community Facebook page, and a few of those places that had got steps said, actually, yeah, if we know that you've got an electric wheelchair and you tell us when you book, we've got ramps, we've got ramp facilities, we'll bring them out and help you get into, or we've got access at the back of the shop that you can, access that's all flat, and, there isn't a ramp needed and that kind of thing. So I think there may be developments there, but nobody's sort of shouting about that. Wouldn't it be great if we saw some signs maybe on the high street that just say, give us a knock, well, we've got a ramp, or I don't know what that is, some sort of creative sign that says, actually, we have got a stepped entry, but ask for the ramp, or a campaign to so people would know. And surely that could be something that could be considered just to help. That would help, so many people not just with disability, elderly, people with mobility issues, I think it would be the first step.
Yeah. Well, interestingly that you should say that, actually, because I think it was just like a few weeks ago. There's a lovely girl called Sophie Christensen. She has competed at the Paralympics numerous times in equestrian, and she has quite a severe cerebral palsy, and she is really, really good at advocating for accessibility and inclusion. And there was a post that she'd put up the other week, actually, about the need for, cafes, pubs, wherever that might be, to actually shout and scream about what accessibility things they've got in place to make things accessible. And one in particular, she'd actually taken a photo. There was one place that actually did put, obviously we've got steps, but if you do require a ramp, just let us know. And actually it's as simple as that, isn't it? Because like you said just a few moments ago, actually, as a person with a disability, our money is just as valuable as anyone else's. So why wouldn't you try making it more accessible?
Exactly, because you're going to have more customers coming in if you can enable those customers to come in. So that's the point, isn't it, really, is there are people who want to go out into the community that have just got this idea that it's not accessible. I'd like to do that study again in Harborne, and maybe do it next year, maybe come on board with Mencap And let's do it again and maybe feed that back into the Harborne community and just say, actually, it's improved. It's great because people have got these signs now, or they've really made an effort with their accessibility. You know, it's not all negative. It is getting there. It is, people are becoming more aware. But we need to get our high streets more accessible, I think, because that's where people tend to go.
Definitely. And I think one thing that I'd absolutely love to do is something similar to like, I don't know, an inaccessible cafe, so that we can open it to the public.
Yeah.
That we can bring people with no disabilities or long-term health conditions into, just so that they can get a taste of how inaccessible things can be.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's until people actually start thinking more so and actually get a taste of things, actually how inaccessible life really is for people.
On a positive note, I went to Calvert Trust recently and we took some citizens from Cerebral Palsy Midlands, and they were amazingly accessible. They'd got everything. Every single room there had, you know, wet room facilities, ceiling track hoists, profile beds. If when you got there you needed a sound monitor or you needed a mini fridge for the medication or you needed anything, they would just really help you. They'd got washing facilities. And then if you went to the chefs and you said, oh, this person needs it blended because they've got dysphagia, no problem. And like, I need a bigger quilt because this person likes to be really tucked in because they've got involuntary movements. Yeah, no problem. And the whole place had got accessible activities. And there are really good places out there that we should sort of, I suppose, maybe promote as being like the champions of being accessible, so that the other places, other facilities or other businesses can look at the champions and go, oh, that's how we do it. That's what we need to have in place.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for coming today. And I suppose just before we finish, is there anything else that you would like to add or...
No, I could talk about accessibility and all the issues and challenges for a really long time. I think I said that. But I think, you know, the work that you're doing with Include Me and the work that we're doing as, you know, working together and collaborating, I think it's only going to, you know, help, really.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as I say, thank you so much for coming along today and talking about your personal experience. I know that our viewers will really enjoy it. So let us know what you guys think, and also putting a question out to you guys. What do you think needs to be done to make life more accessible to you? Comment in and let us know. I'd be really interested to know so that we can put that into the next podcast. See you later.
Bye.